So, you know, I am totally serious, the wonderful world of learning objectives, because I think in a lot of ways it's the key to what we do. So, of course, we can't talk about learning objectives or outcomes without having some for ourselves. So here's what I hope at the end of our half an hour or so together we'll be able to do is we'll think about what it means to have learning objectives, and we'll talk about Bloom's taxonomy as a model for objective writing, and then we'll be able to come up with some. It's not rocket science, but it does take some thought and some planning on our part. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. So, because we're all so, involved with what we do, we know our field so well, sometimes it helps to just clear your head and think about something completely different. So let's imagine that you have a group of 13-year-olds that you are working with, and I'm a former junior high school teacher, actually, so for me this is, that's totally what they look like when you go in and they're all happy and ready to go. Except, maybe a little bit more like that, truth be told. But you've got this group of 13-year-old students that you need to work with, and someone's asked you if you could help them understand the concept of a healthy lifestyle. So just step back, and you think, okay, well, I sort of know what that means, but I don't know about you folks. But for me, when I'm asked to cover a topic, oftentimes what I do is run a Google search, and so you Google healthy lifestyle, and you come up with 106. Billion, gajillion hits on healthy lifestyle. So right away, we have the primary issue, and I think this really makes clear to us why we need to have objectives for our learning. And how are you going to do that? What does healthy lifestyle mean to you? So you have a lot of things you need to think about. So let's just imagine for a minute that you have this task ahead of you. What would you want to think about? You've got a group of 13-year-olds, and you need to tell them about, to work with them to help them understand the concept of a healthy lifestyle. Where would you start? What would you start? So you can imagine no matter what it is that we're planning to teach, there's an overwhelming amount of information. And you need to make some decisions about what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. And from my perspective, having good, solid learning objectives is the way to help you prioritize that information, make sense of it. So, essentially, a learning objective is a statement that helps to describe the essential learning, the key points, what it is you really want your learners to achieve by participating in whatever the activity is that you're going to be doing. And I think this is really a foundational thing to think about in terms of blended learning. Because if you think about what it is that you want your learners to know, to be able to do, then how to do it, how to teach it, whether it's on Blackboard, whether it's face-to-face things, all of those kinds of things should become more obvious once you're clear on what it is that you want to do. So I really think this is the foundational piece in getting started. So there's a principle in education that we talk about a fair bit, and I've kind of hooked onto it in the last number of years because it seems to work really well with physicians. They like the idea, and that's the group of people that I tend to work with, the idea of knowing where you intend to go. So starting with the end in mind. And in the educational theory piece around it is called backwards design. So by knowing where you want to go, you increase the chances of you and the learner ending up there. And it helps you as the teacher then to sort through that 106 billion gajillion hits that you found on Google, or all of the articles that you might have sorted through, all of the things that you know as a practitioner, as a theorist in your field. It helps you start to make sense and put some order around that. So it's helpful for you as a teacher, but also the learners often find having objectives really helpful. So part of the curriculum renewal that we went through in the Faculty of Medicine was making everything objective focused. So now our students expect to see the learning objectives for every given learning activity, whether it's a lecture or if it's a small case-based discussion or a lab, that type of thing. And they're very much objective focused. It helps them to structure the way they prepare for sessions. It helps them to think about how they're going to study for exams, that type of thing. So it's not only a guide for you as a teacher, but it's really helpful for the learners as well. And it allows for some analysis in terms of the level of teaching and learning. So it gives you a hierarchy in terms of thinking about, well, what's what's essential for learners at this stage of the educational process. So there's all kinds of good reasons, I think, to start with writing some really good, solid objectives. So lots of different ways to think about how to do it. Lots and lots of ways. One of the standards, I guess sort of a gold standard in some ways, is Bloom's Taxonomy. Is that familiar to you? You know a little bit about Bloom's? Yeah, it's kind of a universal for those of us who do work in education. You know, and over the years there have been lots of critiques and lots of revisions and lots of new versions, but we always sort of end up back here in some respect. So I think it's an important piece for us to think about it and be informed about. But it's a helpful way to help us think about how we actually create learning objectives. And basically what the taxonomy does is helps us to rank the types of activities that we want our learners to be able to do in order of cognitive complexity. So if it's something really simple, like being able to remember a fact, or is it something more complicated, like being able to synthesize a bunch of information and come up with a diagnosis, for example, in my context. And what's also really helpful about Bloom's taxonomy is that it will help you come up with appropriate and measurable, and that's the key concept here, verbs to help you assess student learners, so to help you make sense of how well your students are actually meeting the objectives that you've set out for them. So there he is. This is Bloom. And I kind of like to throw that one in there because he's, you know, for those of us who do education work, that's the man behind all of this work that we've done in the Faculty of Medicine and all over the place in terms of education. And here's a quote from Bloom, and I think it gives you some, you know, a little bit of understanding about what he thought about and how he helped to structure education and educational reform. So he said, if I could have one wish for education, it would be the systematic ordering of our basic knowledge in such a way that what is known and true can be acted on. So the systematic ordering piece of it is the important piece, I think, of that quote. You had 106 billion hits, and you have to find a way to be systematic in terms of how you're going to approach that. And that's what Bloom's taxonomy will help us with. So, if you were to run a quick Google search for Bloom's taxonomy, you'd see it you know, looks, you see it this way as a pyramid, you'll see it as a pie, wedge pieces, you could see it in terms of a continuum. People use it differently, but this is sort of a, you know, a classic version of it that we can use to help us think about. Basically, when we're talking about ranking knowledge, or ranking cognitive complexity, at the base of the pyramid, when we represent it this way, is knowledge, knowing, being able to recall, to remember things. The next level is around comprehension, so you don't just know and recall, but you can understand the information. And at the next level, you've understood the information and you can actually apply it and use it yourself. You can analyze as you move along, synthesize information, and then evaluate and determine if it's good quality information or not. So basically, you know, at the bottom of the pyramid here are the sort of foundational knowledge-based pieces, and we get more and more complex in terms of the activities of learning as we move through. So, like I say, you can find lots of different representations of Bloom's taxonomy, but that's kind of a basic one to hang on to. So, let's keep this in mind and look at these two objectives. We're addressing the same topic, just I chose a random topic here, dizziness. What do you think about list 5 causes of dizziness? Where do you think that might fall? Knowledge, yeah. It's fairly straightforward. You can, you know, come up with a list of 5. Whereas determine the 3 most likely causes of dizziness in a particular case. Application, yeah. Somewhere, and it would depend, I suppose, on what types of materials you're looking for, but it fits somewhere probably around application, maybe analysis. You'd have maybe a complex situation to think about that kind of thing. So that's another important piece, I think, is that it's not always as clear-cut as this is where knowledge stops, this is where comprehension stops, this is where application stops, that kind of thing. helps you to think about it as a progression. So, objectives are one of these things as well. There are lots of different ways to approach it. In the context that I work in the Faculty of Medicine, when we were cited from the accreditation committee about not having appropriate objectives, they were very specific in the type of objectives that we needed to have, and they are outcome-based learning objectives. So you can come up with lots of different ways to write objectives, but this is a way that I'd like to put forward this morning as a really helpful way to write learning objectives, a helpful way to think about learning objectives. And specifically, outcome-based learning objectives should focus on the learner, not the teacher or the topic. So it's not, I have 106 billion hits about healthy lifestyle and I want to cover it. It's what do they need to know? So you're thinking about the learner. And it sounds kind of funny, but it's true. Oftentimes when we know our topic, we know our subject area so well, it's hard for us to take that step back and think about it in terms of the learner, where they're at, what they need to know at their particular level of education, as opposed to what we want them to know and how we want to share everything that we know. So it focuses on the learner, and students demonstrate what they know and are able to do at the end of the learning experience. So it's not what you want to cover. It's not what they, it's not what would be nice to know. It's what are they able to do. So when we talk about matching our objectives to the outcome, what the outcome of the activity is, and you're using that as a framework. What do you want the outcome of this activity to be? So what's nice about outcome-based learning objectives is they help you to facilitate assessment. So when you're writing an outcome, you know actually where you want the learner to be at the end of the activity, and so you can plan your assessment to demonstrate whether or not the objective was met. So they're useful. They're a useful way to plan an activity. So here's what an outcome-based learning objective would look like. A good, solid outcome-based learning objective. You would focus on a particular learning activity. So that at the end of a lecture, at the end of a lab experience, at the end of whatever your activity might be, the learner will be able to do something, and these action verbs are going to become an important thing to think about when we're writing learning objectives. In a particular setting, so wherever that case may be, to a particular standard. So if you look below, at the end of, for example, this morning, at the end of this presentation, the learner will be able to independently write clear outcomes-based learning objectives, as an example. So do you think you could use that template in your situation to come up with outcome-based objectives? Is it clear enough? The key point, and just I kind of just wanted a reason to put that picture up there. So the key point behind outcome-based learning objectives is, well, you won't bind your legs. That's not it necessarily, but you need to have an action verb. It's something that you can then follow through. So if we look back at the taxonomy, associated with each of these levels would be some verbs that would help you think about knowledge, would help you think about comprehension, application, those kinds of things. So in terms of action words associated with each of those domains, what do you think about knowledge? First of all, what do you think are the kinds of things that people would be doing in the knowledge domain? So here's some examples. It's always interesting when we look at these two. You can argue them one way or the other. These aren't clear cut. Nothing's ever as simple as just put them out there. And these are all the knowledge words and only knowledge words and that type of thing. You want your learners to be able to define a key concept or to name something. These are things that you want them to know, to recall. There's a lot of interesting conversation that goes on when you get into actual planning and developing a curriculum about, lots of people will say, oh, we don't need this, this isn't important, I want to have higher order objectives, that type of things. some really interesting educational debates that come in about whether or not it's appropriate to have a graduate student be able to name key concepts, and how do you structure them, and should they be staged, and all of those kinds of questions. So it's interesting to think about. But those are some helpful words. Can you think of maybe a sample objective related to knowing them? Yeah, that's it. But very simple, very straightforward, but probably foundational to what you're knowing and what you're building on. What about comprehension? Understand? Let's hang on to that example of understand, because that's one of those interesting concepts to think about, interesting words. But I think it's a good one to think about. Other ideas? So what would you want your learner, I think, and this is the key, in my opinion, to all of this, is if you ask yourself the question, what do you want your learner to be able to do at the end of the learning activity, whatever that might be, it really helps you to think about what the objectives should look like. So what do you think with that question in mind? That's exactly it. That's the key kind of challenge with using the word understand. And I've had some really interesting conversations with people where they say, but you've asked me to say what do I want them to be able to do at the end of this lecture, and I want them to be able to understand it. So from that perspective, sure, it makes sense. But when you're thinking about them in terms of the outcome-based format, which is the way that that's the way that worked for us in the context that I work in, the question that I would ask is, well, okay, how would someone demonstrate to you that they've understood? How would you know that they've understood? So let's think about that. Let's say action, okay, see, I don't understand what that means. Fair enough. But let's take that and work it through. So how would you know that somebody understood action potential? Yeah. So it's not, the problem isn't that you don't want them to understand, but the problem is, well, how do you know that they've understood, that type of thing? And that's where having an outcome type of approach is helpful in designing your objectives. Any other questions? Other thoughts about comprehension types of activities? So let's take a look at some examples here. Can you think of learning activities that would help you, where some of these words would be appropriate to use?
So there's something like a case study would help with a recognized kind of objective.
Exactly. What about review? Can you think of something maybe in your context around reviewing?
It's awfully close to memorization.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky. These words they're guidelines. You need to think about them, and again, it might look quite different in the way I used it in my learning activity than Adrian would use it and somebody else would use it. So you need to be thoughtful about it. But yeah, it might be not exactly what you wanted to get at.
Because I was thinking, like the word like identify was mentioned in the first one, but it depends what you're doing when you're identifying something. If you're identifying the difference between something, or identifying what type this is, or compared
Which
to just
principle
Yeah.
is in action in your particular situation.
Right.
So I guess what you had outlined in red is important in context.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Let's look
under
back.
what conditions? So yeah, the same verb could mean different things depending upon what you're asking them to do.
Exactly. But if you think about each of these colored phrases when you are putting it together, so what is the learning activity? What is the action verb might almost come at the end of putting that together. What's the setting and what's the standard? Do you want them to be able to do it expertly? Do you want them to be able to have an introductory understanding? Do you want them to be able to, have the level of review it at the level of a third year clerk, that type of thing. So all of these things are really important to think about. It's really easy to sit down and fire off some, they'll be able to. discuss, identify, discuss, identify, discuss, identify, which is what we're, it's really tempting to do. But when you start asking yourself these kinds of questions, it becomes a little bit time consuming because there is a lot of information to sort and make sense of. But I think it will help you to become really clear, and it will help you sort through all of the different information that you need to weigh and determine if it's appropriate for your learners at the stage that they're at. And I really do think that question of what do you want your learners to be able to do, not what do you want them to know, what do you want them to understand, what do you want them to be able to do, is a helpful one to think about. So comprehension, some application. And again, some of these, might cross over different areas of the taxonomy, but that's okay. It's up to you to make the determination in your context when you're thinking about all the different conditions and putting an objective together. What about analysis? We're becoming a little more cognitively complex. Analyze. It's there. It's on the list, so it's totally legit. What about synthesis? Which is a word I have to really concentrate to say. Synthesis. Any thoughts about that? This is actually a really important category for the work that we do in medicine with students as they become closer to actually working with real-life patients. And you need to be able to synthesize information from a number of different sources in order to make a suggestion in terms of treatment or management path, that type of thing. So synthesis might include these kinds of information. We're becoming more complex in what we're asking our learners to be able to do. And then, and different versions of Bloom's taxonomy too, where we use different terms and different ideas. But essentially, at the very most cognitively complex type of task that we'd be asking our learners to do is to evaluate. So to judge sources of information, make calls about them, appraise, evaluate, those kinds of things. And it's interesting. There's a temptation to say, these are first-year students, and so they need to be all knowledge and application types of objectives, that type of thing. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Again, I think it's thinking about asking yourself that question: what do you want them to be able to do? What do they need to be able to do at the end of whatever the learning activity is? So my suggestion, if I was planning a course, I would start out by asking myself the question: what do I want these learners to be able to do at the end of this course? Come up with a set of learning objectives, and then I would ask myself, what are the best pedagogical approaches, the best teaching strategies in order to meet those objectives? Some objectives might be best met in a face-to-face small group session. Some might be appropriately met through online interactions, those types of things. So I really think getting clear on what it is that you want your learners to be able to do is at the foundation of thinking about blended learning. Here's the understand conversation that we got into because we're just so tuned in to these kinds of things, which is fantastic. So last thing that we should take a quick look at is how could we actually improve this objective? By the end of this course, I expect students to increase their organization, writing, and presentation skills. First of all,
Separate them
we could separate them out, absolutely. But who is this objective focusing on? It's what you as a teacher know and what you want them to be able to do. So how would you make that maybe a more learner-centered? So you need to ask yourself the question, what do you want the students to be able to do? Not what should the students, not what do you want, but what should the students be able to do? So it's flipping the way that you think about things. Well, what we found in the process of curriculum renewal, and I'll wrap it up after this, but it was really tricky. When we renewed the curriculum in the Faculty of Medicine, we made a lot of changes in terms of the number of hours that people had available for lectures, and everything looked different and it felt different, and people who had been teaching the same course or the same subject for years had to rethink the way that they've been doing things. It felt uncomfortable for a lot of people, and people would say, I used to have 20 hours of lecture time and now I only have 11, and how can I possibly cover the same amount of information? Thinking about it this way helps you to let go of that sort of time focus and think about what do the learners need to be able to do, and then how can you get there. Oftentimes, a lecture might not be the right way to do it, might not be the best way to do it. So I think that planning with objectives from the start will help you to think creatively about the strategies that you use, whether they're online or face-to-face. So there's an example of how you might restructure this to make it an outcomes-based, student-centered objective. Students will be able to produce professional quality writing, effectively communicate the results of their research findings to fellow classmates in an oral presentation. So it's much more specific, measurable. You'll know if you've met those objectives in the context of your learning activity. So that's it from me.